You don't belong here. This is the VIP section.
The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the ballroom, where the city's elite gathered for the annual gala. Nyelle Rivers sat quietly at her assigned table, her elegant white evening gown catching the light as she adjusted her position in her wheelchair. At 24, she possessed a beauty that seemed to glow from within, though most people's eyes never quite made it past the chrome and leather that carried her. She watched the crowd move like a living organism, couples gliding across the floor, business deals being struck over champagne, and social climbers desperately seeking their next rung on the ladder. Her fingers traced the rim of her untouched water glass as she tried to make herself smaller, invisible, a skill she had perfected since the accident. "Excuse me." A harsh voice cut through her thoughts. A prominent guest stood before her table with an entourage of equally pompous associates. "You're in my seat." Nyelle looked up, tears already beginning to strain her glossy eyes. "I'm sorry, but the coordinator assigned me here." "My name card is right here," she whispered, gesturing to the elegant calligraphy. The man's face contorted with irritation as he snatched the card, crumpling it in his fist. "I don't care what some planner wrote down. This is the VIP section, and you clearly don't belong here." His eyes swept over her wheelchair with undisguised disdain. "These tables are for people who actually matter, not charity cases who got a pity invite." The words hit Nyelle like physical blows. She felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as nearby guests began to notice the confrontation, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they turned to watch the spectacle unfold. A semicircle of spectators formed, watching her break down with neutral, detached expressions. "Please," Nyelle's voice came out barely above a whisper, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair until her knuckles turned white. "I don't want any trouble. I'll move." She began to will herself backward, but the man stepped closer, blocking her path. "What did you think would happen? That you'd roll in here and suddenly be accepted?" he sneered, his voice rising to ensure maximum audience participation in her humiliation. "People like you are reminders of weakness, of failure." Nyelle looked at the crowd, her eyes pleading for help, but she found only a wall of indifferent observers. "Please, don't hurt me," she cried, her voice finally breaking. "I can't walk." That was when Kwon Ashar appeared. He had been standing in the shadows, nursing a glass of whiskey and observing the gala with detached interest. As he watched the bully tower over the trembling woman in white, the mask of indifference cracked, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. He set down his glass with deliberate slowness and began walking toward the circle of silence. The heavy silence of the ballroom felt more suffocating than the humidity of a New York summer. Nyelle Rivers sat frozen, her fingers digging into the cool, synthetic fabric of her wheelchair's armrests until her knuckles mirrored the stark white of her gown. She had spent years mastering the art of the quiet sufferer, believing that if she remained still and composed, she could navigate the world without being a burden or a spectacle. But here, under the unforgiving glare of 1,000 crystals, that mask was being stripped away. The man standing over her was Julian Vane, a venture capitalist whose reputation for disrupting markets was only matched by his penchant for disrupting lives. He didn't just look at Nyelle, he looked through her, as if her presence were a smudge on a lens he was trying to clean. "Is there a problem with the acoustics, or are you just as slow as your wheels?" Julian's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the low hum of the orchestra. He didn't lower his volume, he amplified it, turning their corner of the VIP section into a stage. "I asked you a simple question. Why are you occupying a seat that could be filled by someone who actually contributes to the prestige of this gala?" Nyelle's breath hitched. She looked up, her dark skin shimmering under a thin veil of cold sweat. Her eyes, glossy and strained, searched the faces around her for a flicker of solidarity. Instead, she found a semicircle of observers. They were the city's elite, men in $5,000 tuxedos and women draped in silk, standing like statues in a gallery of indifference. They didn't intervene. They didn't even look angry. Their expressions were neutral, detached, as if they were watching a moderately interesting documentary about a world they would never have to inhabit. I was invited, Nyelle managed to whisper, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. I am a donor. I'm here for the foundation. A donor? Julian laughed, a dry, hollow sound that drew even more onlookers into the circle. He snatched her name card from the table, his manicured thumb smudging the ink of her name. You're a patient, Nyelle. A success story they use to make the real donors feel better about their tax write-offs. You aren't a peer, you're an exhibit. And right now, you're an exhibit that's taking up a prime view of the stage. He crumpled the card with a slow, deliberate squeeze of his fist and let it fall. It didn't hit the floor, it landed in her lap, a small, mangled ball of cardstock that felt as heavy as a lead weight. Nyelle felt the first hot tear track down her cheek. She tried to wipe it away quickly, but her hands were shaking too violently. She felt small, smaller than she had ever felt in the 3 years since her accident. The crowd's passivity was more painful than Julian's vitriol. She saw a woman she recognized from the hospital board, someone who had once shaken her hand and called her inspiring, now carefully adjusting her pearl necklace and looking at a spot just above Nyelle's head. The silence of the observers was a physical force, a collective agreement that her dignity was less valuable than the social comfort of the room. Please, Nyelle choked out, her posture collapsing inward, her shoulders drawing toward her chest in a desperate attempt to protect what little was left of her spirit. Don't do this. I'll go. Just, let me pass. She tried to grip the rims of her wheels to back away, but Julian didn't move. He stood his ground, towering over her, a silhouette of corporate arrogance. You see, he said, addressing the silent circle as if he were giving a lecture. This is what happens when you let pity dictate your guest list. You get fragility where there should be strength. You get a reminder of failure in a room designed for triumph. Nyelle couldn't hold it back anymore. The emotional exhaustion of the last 3 years, the constant struggle to be seen as more than a tragedy, and the sheer weight of the crowd's cold eyes finally broke her. She let out a soft, jagged sob, her head dropping as she covered her face with her hands. She was a young woman in a beautiful white dress, breaking down in the center of a temple of wealth, surrounded by a dozen people who could have stopped it with a single word, but chose instead to watch the shadows dance on the marble floor. The hum of the ballroom, once a sophisticated backdrop of clinking crystal and hushed networking, had curdled into a heavy, suffocating silence. Nyelle felt the weight of every eye in the room, yet not a single pair met hers with kindness. She was no longer a guest, she was a spectacle, a crack in the polished veneer of the evening that Julian Vane seemed determined to widen. I'm waiting, Nyelle, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory purr that carried further than a shout. The exits are wide enough for that contraption, aren't they? Or do we need to call maintenance to clear a path for the special guest? Nyelle's posture, usually a testament to a dignity she had fought hard to maintain since the accident, finally began to buckle. She drew her shoulders inward, her shoulder blades sharpening against the fine silk of her white gown as if she could physically shrink away from the cruelty. Her hands, resting on the cold metal of her wheelchair, gripped the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned a ghostly gray. She felt the sudden, frantic urge to vanish, to dissolve into the marble floor and become just another shadow cast by the chandeliers. I don't belong. She whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It was the dark thought she had fought for 3 years, the lie she told herself in the middle of the night, now being validated by a room full of the city's most powerful people. Exactly, Julian sneered, leaning in closer. His expensive cologne, sharp and metallic, invaded her space. You don't. This room is for the architects of the future, for the movers and shakers. You are a reminder of what happens when things break. And frankly, nobody paid $10,000 a plate to look at a broken athlete. The cruelty was so clinical, so precise, that it seemed to vibrate through the air. Nyelle looked out at the semicircle of spectators. She saw a prominent fashion editor she admired, a woman known for her inclusive campaigns, simply sip her champagne and turn her head slightly to catch a better view of the humiliation. She saw the hospital's chief of surgery, the man who had overseen her rehab, check his gold watch with an expression of mild boredom. The fear in Nyelle's eyes was no longer a private struggle, it was visible to the entire room. Her pupils were blown wide, her gaze darting like a trapped bird's. The glossy strain in her eyes finally broke, and a fresh wave of tears spilled over, hot and shaming. She wasn't just crying because of the words, she was crying because the silence of the crowd confirmed them. Their passivity was a verdict, she was an outsider, a charity case, a nuisance. Please, she sobbed, a jagged, broken sound that should have moved a heart of stone. She tried to wheel herself backward, but her coordination failed her in her panic. The chair lurched awkwardly, hitting the edge of the table and causing the silver cutlery to rattle with a sound like mocking laughter. Julian didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a silhouette of unrelenting arrogance, basking in the power of his own malice. "Look at you," he said, his voice rising again to ensure the back of the room could hear. "Trembling, crying, making a scene. You're proving my point with every breath you take. You aren't just out of place, Nyelle. You're a failure of decorum." In that moment, Nyelle Rivers was truly at her breaking point. The quiet sufferer had been pushed until there was nowhere left to retreat. She sat in the center of the gilded ballroom, a woman in a pristine white dress that now felt like a shroud, exposed and abandoned by every person she had once hoped to impress. The world was a blur of shimmering lights and cold, neutral faces, and for the first time in her life, she felt the terrifying weight of being utterly, completely alone. The atmosphere in the ballroom had grown thick with a voyeuristic cruelty, a collective holding of breath as the elite watched Nyelle's spirit fracture. But at the edge of the VIP section, near a pillar draped in velvet, the stillness changed. Kwon Ashar had been watching the scene unfold with the predatory patience of a man who dealt in the currency of truth and consequences. He was younger than many of the titans in the room, but he carried an ancient, heavy authority that made the air around him feel cold. He leaned against the marble, his sharp black suit blending into the shadows. In his hand, a crystal glass of amber whiskey caught the overhead light. He hadn't moved a muscle as Julian Vane began his assault, but his dark, hooded eyes had never left Nyelle. He saw the way she pulled her shoulders inward, he saw the glossy and strained look in her eyes that spoke of 1,000 private battles. When she finally broke, the sound of her jagged sob seemed to resonate against the glass in his hand. With a movement that was deliberate and terrifyingly smooth, Kwon straightened. He didn't rush. He simply set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a muted clink that seemed to echo louder than Julian's shouting. As he began to walk, the living organism of the crowd underwent a sudden, instinctive cellular shift. These were people who spent their lives calculating risk, and every primal instinct they possessed screamed that the man moving toward the center of the room was the ultimate risk. Kwon didn't say a word, but the semicircle of spectators, the fashion editors, the surgeons, the heirs, instinctively stepped back. They parted like a dark sea, their neutral expressions finally flickering into something resembling genuine or wary interest. Kwon's presence was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room as he cut through the space. His dark hair was neatly styled, his white dress shirt crisp and authoritative, but it was his focus that was most striking. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the entourage. His gaze was locked onto the woman in the white gown who was currently trying to hide her face from the world. Julian Vane, sensing a change in the room's temperature, turned around, his mouth open to deliver another barbed insult. The words died in his throat. He was a man used to bullying those he deemed lesser, but he now found himself staring at a man whose reputation preceded him in whispers, a man whispered to be the silent hand behind the city's most complex underground architectures. Kwon didn't stop until he was inches from the perimeter Julian had established. He didn't raise his hand or raise his voice. He simply occupied the space with a grounded, deliberate power that made Julian's aggressive posturing look like the frantic fluttering of a moth. The silent enforcer had entered the light, and for the first time that evening, the heavy, oppressive weight of the crowd's judgment wasn't directed at the woman in the wheelchair. It was pinned under the cold, selective mercy of the man who had decided that the silence had lasted long enough. The heavy silence that had followed Kwon Ashar across the ballroom floor now solidified into a vacuum of pure, breathless shock. Julian Vane stood paralyzed, his mouth half open as if to protest, but the words were strangled by the sheer intensity of the presence before him. Kwon didn't spare a glance for Julian or the semicircle of gawking elites. His world had narrowed down to the woman in the white gown, whose quiet sobs were the only sound left in the gilded hall. Then, the unthinkable happened. Kwon Ashar, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror in the city's most guarded circles, a man who never bowed, never bent, and never yielded, slowly lowered himself. With a grace that was both grounded and deliberate, he sank onto one knee on the cold marble floor. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, a sharp intake of air that rippled through the silk and sequins. To see a man of his stature kneeling was a visual paradox. It was an act of profound humility, yet it felt like the most powerful thing anyone in the room had ever done. He didn't look smaller on the ground. Instead, the room seemed to realign itself around him, lowering the center of gravity until the only two people who mattered were the man on his knee and the woman in the chair. "Nyelle," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant, velvet quality that cut through her panic like a steady hand through a storm. Nyelle's hands were still shielding her face, her shoulders trembling with the weight of her humiliation. At the sound of her name, her fingers parted slightly. Through the glossy veil of her tears, she saw him. He wasn't looking at her wheelchair, and he wasn't looking at her as a charity case. His dark eyes were fixed on hers with an intensity that was neither pitying nor romantic. It was a focused, protective recognition. Gently, Kwon reached out. His hands were large, steady, and warm as he took both of her shaking hands in his. He didn't pull or squeeze, he simply held them, offering a physical anchor to a woman who felt like she was drifting away into a sea of shame. The contrast was striking. Her smooth, dark skin against his pale, polished sleeves, her vulnerability meeting his unshakable discipline. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Nyelle lowered her hands fully, her breath hitching in her chest. For the first time since the accident, someone in a room like this was looking at her as an equal, or perhaps, in this moment, as someone superior to the sharks circling her. Kwon's posture remained grounded, his gaze never wavering. By kneeling, he had effectively removed the height advantage Julian had used to intimidate her. He had brought himself down to her level, not out of weakness, but as a deliberate choice to shield her. The elites in the background watched, their neutral masks finally shattered by confusion and awe. They had ignored her cries for help, viewing her as an invisible fixture of the room, but now they were forced to acknowledge her. By holding her hands and kneeling at her feet, Kwon had made Nyelle Rivers the most important person in the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom. "You do not need to move," Kwon said, his voice carrying a cold edge as his eyes finally flickered briefly toward Julian, though his hands remained firmly clasped around Nyelle's. "And you certainly do not need to apologize for taking up space in a room filled with people who have forgotten what it means to have a soul." Nyelle felt a strange, flickering heat in her chest, the first spark of dignity she had felt in years. The fear in her glossy eyes began to recede, replaced by a stunned, fragile wonder. She looked down at their joined hands, then back at the man kneeling before her, realizing that the silent guardian hadn't just stepped in to stop a fight, he had stepped in to restore her world. Kwon Ashar did not stand up. He remained on one knee, his fingers still anchored around Nyelle's trembling hands, but the warmth he had directed toward her evaporated the moment he tilted his head toward Julian Vane. The shift in the room's temperature was instantaneous. It was as if the glittering warmth of the gala had been sucked into a void, leaving only the biting, clinical chill of a man who dealt in the absolute finality of the underground. Kwon's eyes, which had been soft with a rare, selective mercy for Nyelle, now hardened into shards of obsidian. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. In his world, the loudest man was often the weakest, and Julian Vane's previous shouting now seemed like the desperate buzzing of a fly against a windowpane. Julian Vane, Kwon said, the name sounding like a sentence passed in a high court. Venture capitalist. Disruptor. And, as of 3 minutes ago, a man with a very expensive lapse in judgment. Julian tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. He looked at the semicircle of his pompous associates, but they had retreated even further into the shadows of the marble pillars, eyes wide and fixed on their shoes. They knew the name Ashar. They knew that while the men in this room moved stocks and bonds, the man kneeling on the floor moved the very foundations those men stood upon. I was just explaining the seating arrangements, Mr. Ashar, Julian stammered, his previous arrogance crumbling into a pathetic, high-pitched defense. There was a misunderstanding with the cards. A mistake. The mistake, Kwon interrupted, his voice a low, lethal vibration, was thinking that your status gave you the right to touch what wasn't yours and to wound someone who has more strength in her smallest finger than you have in your entire bloodline. Kwon's gaze flickered to the crumpled name card on Nyelle's lap. Pick it up. Julian blinked, frozen. What? Pick it up. The command was so sharp that Julian flinched as if he'd been struck. Under the silent, judging gaze of the city's elite, the billionaire venture capitalist slowly bent over. His face turned a deep, humiliated purple as he reached down near Nyelle's wheelchair to retrieve the mangled ball of cardstock. Smooth it out, Kwon directed, his focus never wavering from Julian's face. Every crease. Every wrinkle. You will realize, Vane, that everything has a cost. Cruelty is the most expensive debt a man can accrue, and I am the one who collects. With shaking fingers, Julian tried to flatten the card against his palm. The calligraphy of Nyelle's name was smudged and broken, a physical metaphor for the evening's events. Now, Kwon continued, his voice dropping even lower, you will apologize. Not to me. Not to the room. To Miss Rivers. And you will do it with the same volume you used to humiliate her. Julian looked around, desperate for a reprieve, but he found none. The crowd was no longer detached, they were watching his downfall with the same morbid curiosity they had used to watch Nyelle's pain. Kwon's presence had turned the hunter into the prey. I'm sorry, Nyelle, Julian whispered. Louder, Kwon commanded. I am sorry, Miss Rivers. Julian shouted, his voice cracking with the weight of his own public execution. I was wrong. You belong here. Kwon finally released Nyelle's hands, though he patted them once with a gentle, grounding touch before standing up. He rose to his full height, a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire VIP section. He took the flattened card from Julian's trembling hand and placed it back on the table with surgical precision. Tomorrow morning, your board of directors will receive a file regarding the creative accounting of your offshore holdings, Kwon said softly, leaning in so only Julian could hear the death knell of his career. Consider it the interest on the debt you created tonight. Now, leave. Before I decide that a verbal apology isn't enough to balance the scales. Julian didn't wait. He turned and fled, his entourage scurrying after him like rats from a sinking ship. The semicircle of spectators remained, but their neutral masks were gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Kwon turned back to Nyelle, his expression smoothing into that serious, controlled mask once more. The cost of cruelty had been paid in full, and for the first time in the history of that ballroom, the quiet sufferer was the only one left standing, or sitting, with her head held high. The predator had vanished, but the silenced Julian Vane left behind was different than the one that had preceded him. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a hunt, it was the hushed, electric stillness of a room that had just witnessed a shift in the natural order. Kwon Ashar stood tall, his shadow long and steady against the marble, but his focus remained entirely on Nyelle. "The air is clearer now," Kwon said softly, extending a hand not to lead her away, but to invite her forward. "But a gala is for more than just witnessing the fall of small men. It is for the music." Nyelle looked up at him, her dark skin still shimmering with the remnants of her distress, though her glossy eyes had begun to clear. "I can't. I don't really do the music anymore," she whispered, a small, sad gesture toward the wheels of her chair. "That," Kwon replied, a rare, ghost of a smile touching his disciplined features, "is a failure of imagination on the part of the room, not a limitation of the woman." Without waiting for her to retreat into herself, Kwon moved to the back of her wheelchair. He didn't grab the handles with the frantic energy of someone trying to be helpful, he placed his hands on the leather grips with a deliberate, grounded grace. As he began to move her, the crowd, those who had stood by in neutral detachment, parted like the wake of a great ship. They didn't just move toward the edges of the ballroom, they moved toward the dance floor. The orchestra, sensing the shift in gravity, transitioned from a rigid march into a sweeping, melodic waltz. As they reached the center of the floor, the polished wood reflecting the crystal light like a dark lake, Kwon didn't merely push her. He began a new choreography. He moved in a rhythmic, sweeping motion, using the momentum of the wheelchair to create long, elegant arcs that mimicked the flow of the dancers around them. He leaned into the turns, his sharp black suit a blur of focused motion, while Nyelle sat at the heart of the movement. At first, Nyelle held her breath, her posture tense. But as the music swelled, she felt the vibration of the floor beneath her wheels and the steady, unshakable strength of Kwon's hands. She realized she wasn't being steered, she was being partnered. Kwon moved with her, his steps perfectly synchronized with the rotation of her wheels. When the music dipped, he pulled the chair into a tight, spinning pivot that made her white gown flare out like the petals of a lily. The semicircle of observers was back, but the expressions were no longer neutral. They were watching with a stunned, genuine appreciation. They saw the quiet sufferer transformed. Nyelle began to lift her chin, her shoulders unfurling as she realized that the chrome and leather wasn't a cage, it was part of the dance. Kwon leaned down, his voice a low murmur near her ear as they glided past the very table where she had been humiliated. "They see you now, Nyelle. Not because I am here, but because you are allowing yourself to be seen." For the first time in 3 years, Nyelle felt the rush of the wind against her face, the same thrill she had felt as an athlete. She wasn't an exhibit of failure or a charity case. She was the center of the room's rhythm. Kwon's new choreography was a silent proclamation that her presence was not a burden to be accommodated, but a beauty to be celebrated. As the final notes of the waltz echoed through the Grand Metropolitan, Kwon brought the chair to a slow, perfect halt in the middle of the floor. He didn't immediately move away. He stood behind her, a silent guardian, as the ballroom erupted into a spontaneous, thunderous applause. Nyelle didn't look down at the floor. She looked straight ahead, her eyes bright and her spirit finally taking up the space she had earned. The limitations that had felt so heavy moments ago were gone, revealed as nothing more than the fragile illusions of people who were too small to understand true strength. The roar of the applause eventually faded into the soft, rhythmic hum of the gala's closing hours. The grand ballroom, once a battlefield of social hierarchy, now felt smaller, its edges softened by the dimming lights. Kwon had guided Nyelle away from the center stage to a quiet balcony overlooking the city skyline. The cool night air of New York brushed against her heated skin, a welcome relief from the stifling intensity of the indoors. Nyelle looked out at the twinkling lights of the skyscrapers, her hands resting peacefully on her lap. The shaking had finally stopped. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "A man like you didn't have to kneel. You didn't have to risk your reputation for someone like me." Kwon stepped up to the stone railing, his sharp profile silhouetted against the amber glow of the city. He didn't look like a mafia boss in this light, he looked like a man carrying the weight of a long, unwritten history. He stayed silent for a moment, the only sound the distant siren of a lonely ambulance blocks away. "In my world, power is often measured by how much you can take," he began, his voice a gravelly murmur. "But I was raised by a woman who taught me that true power is measured by what you can protect. My grandmother." Nyelle turned her head, watching the way his expression shifted at the mention of her. The cold, obsidian mask he had worn while confronting Julian Vane was gone, replaced by a somber reverence. "She didn't live in a palace or attend galas in white gowns," Kwon continued, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "She ran a small grocery in a neighborhood where the police didn't like to go. For 20 years, she walked with a heavy limp, a souvenir from a strike she led when the local factories tried to starve the workers. She was small, she was broken by the world's standards, but she was the only person I ever feared. And the only person I ever truly respected." He turned away from the skyline to look directly at Nyelle. The intensity in his eyes wasn't protective anymore, it was reflective. "When I saw you sitting there, surrounded by those vultures, I didn't see a charity case. I saw her. I saw that same quiet, stubborn fire. The kind that refuses to go out even when everyone else is trying to blow it out." Nyelle felt a lump form in her throat. For years, she had viewed her wheelchair and her injury as a wall that separated her from the real world, a source of shame that made her less than the person she used to be. But Kwon was looking at the gap between their worlds, his world of violence and shadows, and her world of endurance and light, and he was building a bridge over it. "She used to tell me that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones with the guns," Kwon said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They are the ones who can lose everything and still find a way to dance. Tonight, Nyelle, you danced. I only provided the music." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a second before he gently placed it over her own. It wasn't a gesture of a savior, but of a peer. In that moment, the shadow of the Korean underground and the quiet sufferer of the elite ballroom found a common language. "You think your accident made you weak," he said, his focus unwavering. "But it only stripped away the things that didn't matter. What's left is the part of you that Julian Vane could never understand. That is the part one support." Nyelle breathed in the crisp night air, her chest expanding with a fullness she hadn't felt since before the crash. The gap had been bridged. She realized then that she didn't need to be invisible to be safe. She just needed to remember that the strength she had been searching for wasn't something she had lost on a rainy New York street 3 years ago, it was the very thing that had kept her in the room tonight. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 8, where Nyelle begins her transformation into a global advocate with Kwon's support? The months following the gala did not just change Nyelle's surroundings, they rearranged the very fabric of her soul. The quiet sufferer, who had once sought the refuge of shadows, now moved with a purpose that commanded the light. With Kwon's formidable resources acting as the wind beneath her wings, Nyelle didn't just return to her life, she rebuilt it into a fortress for others. Kwon's support was as silent and absolute as the man himself. He didn't offer pity or a simple donation, he offered infrastructure. He opened doors to Silicon Valley boardrooms and international policy summits that had previously been locked tight to someone they deemed a charity case. Through his network, Nyelle launched the Rivers Initiative, a foundation dedicated to rewriting the global standards for urban accessibility and athlete rehabilitation. She began to spend her days in a sun-drenched office in Lower Manhattan, a space Kwon had helped her secure, where the glass walls overlooked the same city that had once tried to ignore her. She was no longer tracing the rim of an untouched water glass in fear, she was sketching blueprints and signing contracts. Her voice, once barely a whisper in the grand metropolitan ballroom, now carried a resonant authority that demanded attention in city council meetings and tech seminars. Her spirit began to unfurl like a vibrant flag, catching the wind of her new reality. The defensive posture, the drawn-in shoulders and downcast eyes, had vanished. In its place was a woman who wore her scars and her wheelchair as symbols of a hard-won victory. She traded the invisible white gowns for bold, structured blazers and vibrant colors that signaled her arrival before she even spoke. She was no longer holding herself together, she was expanding. One afternoon, as she prepared for the launch of her first major accessibility app, Kwon appeared at her office. He didn't announce himself, he simply stood in the doorway, watching her navigate a complex digital layout on a massive touchscreen monitor. He saw the way she laughed with her team, the way she pointed out flaws with a sharp, analytical mind, and the way her eyes, no longer glossy with strain, glowed with a fierce, intellectual fire. "You look different in this light," Kwon remarked, stepping into the room. Nyelle turned her chair toward him, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. "I feel different. I used to think my accident was the end of my story. I thought everything after the crash was just a long, slow epilogue." She gestured to the maps of the city on the screens behind her, glowing with the data points of her new initiative. "But this feels like the real book has finally started." Kwon nodded, his expression serious but filled with a quiet pride. "I told you that you were a dancer who just needed a different kind of music. You found your rhythm, Nyelle." The transformation was absolute. She was no longer a victim of a cruel elite or a bystander to her own life. With every project launched and every barrier broken, Nyelle Rivers was proving that her value was not measured by her ability to walk, but by her capacity to lead. Like a flag reaching its full height in a gale, she stood for something far greater than herself, a testament to the fact that when the right ally meets a resilient spirit, the world has no choice but to change. The skyline of New York glowed with a soft, amber warmth through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel's rooftop lounge. It was the night of the Rivers Initiative's 3rd anniversary, and the room was filled with the same caliber of guests who had once formed a circle of silence around Nyelle Rivers. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. There were no neutral or detached expressions, there was only respect, bordering on awe. Nyelle sat near the balcony edge, her presence commanding the space with an effortless, quiet dignity. She wore a simple, refined gown of midnight blue that complemented her dark skin, her hair styled back with the same neat precision she had always favored. She was no longer trying to make herself smaller or invisible. Instead, she leaned into conversations, her voice steady and sure, a far cry from the breaking whisper of 3 years ago. From across the room, she felt the familiar, grounded weight of a gaze. Kwon Ashar stood by the bar, looking every bit the disciplined, silent enforcer, in his sharp black suit. He didn't approach, he didn't need to. He watched her lead the room with the same pride a mentor feels for a protege, or perhaps, with the recognition of a man who had simply cleared the path so a queen could find her throne. Nyelle took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She looked down at her hands, the same hands Kwon had held while kneeling on a cold marble floor, and realized that her transformation hadn't been about becoming someone new. It had been about rediscovering the woman who had survived the crash, the athlete who had refused to die, and the visionary who had been buried under the weight of other people's pity. She realized then that Kwon hadn't been her savior in the traditional sense. He was a selective guardian who had seen a spark and chosen to shield it from the wind. By kneeling, he hadn't given her power, he had forced the world to acknowledge the power she already possessed. He had been the catalyst that allowed her spirit to unfurl, proving that vulnerability was not a sign of failure, but a prerequisite for true courage. As the evening wound down, Kwon finally made his way toward her. He moved with that same predatory grace, the crowd parting for him out of habit and hushed reverence. He stopped beside her chair, looking out at the city they had both, in their own ways, conquered. "They aren't looking at the chair anymore, Nyelle," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. Nyelle smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes, which were clear and bright, devoid of the glossy strain of the past. "No," she agreed. "They're looking at me." She looked at the man who had seen her at her lowest and hadn't looked away. She saw the selective mercy in his eyes and the unshakable integrity he carried in a world riddled with cruelty. She understood now that true strength wasn't found in the absence of pain or the ability to walk, it was found in the persistence of the soul. Nyelle Rivers was no longer the shy girl, crying in the shadows. She was a guarded hero in her own right, a testament to the fact that allies can come from the most dangerous places, and that the most profound impact one person can have is simply to stand up and say, "I see you." As she watched the city lights flicker like a million tiny victories, she knew her story was no longer an epilogue. It was a masterpiece in progress, written in the ink of resilience and the iron of honor. It's been a journey following Nyelle's rise to power. Would you like me to create a final epilogue, or perhaps a character profile for Kwon Ashar's mysterious background? Nyelle and Kwon's journey is a powerful reminder that even in a world often riddled with cruelty, judgment, and the cold indifference of the elite, there are still those who choose integrity. It serves as a testament that true strength is not found in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to embrace who you are, resilience, wheelchair, and all. Nyelle learned that vulnerability is not weakness, and that allies can emerge from the most dangerous and unexpected places. Kwon, in turn, found a purpose beyond the shadows of his empire, discovering that the most honorable use of power is to lift up the voices the world tries to silence. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you walk into a room and see an injustice unfolding, when you see someone pushed to the brink by the arrogance of others, what will you choose? Will you remain part of the silent semicircle, watching from a distance with neutral detachment? Or will you find the courage to be the one who kneels, the one who sees, and the one who stands up? Don't just watch the shadows dance. Be the light that changes the room.